Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It is Thursday, April 2nd, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. We're recording this a day or two before the Passover holiday. Today is the first day of Pesach, and I'm here with Rossella Tercatin.
Hello.
Hello. Rossella is our archaeology and religions reporter, and she's going to be talking a little bit about the religion side of her beat today. Not going to go into headlines because on this particular moment, in this particular war, we really don't know what will be on Thursday. So know that we are going to be talking about a story that Rossella wrote regarding the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. It's an institution full of masterpieces that have basically not been seen for most of the last 47 years since the Islamic Revolution. We'll talk about all of that in a minute, as well as a new Passover Haggadah that really delves into the Egyptian side of the story and what parts of it are relevant to the Haggadah that we read today. So stay with us. Okay. So, Rossella, you and I are both in our beats during a war. We find our way around what is happening and kind of give the background stories, I find, which can be a challenge and can also yield really fantastic stories and articles.
Fascinating things.
So what I kept on thinking about as I read this story a couple of times over is, I hadn't actually spoken to you about this. What was the kernel that brought you to this story idea? And then we'll talk about, obviously, what you found out. But what brought you to it?
So, the fact that this museum exists and it has all these masterpieces is not in a way new. So just to give people a little bit of a background of what the museum is. So, Iran used to be a very different country before the Islamic Revolution. It used to be ruled by a king or an emperor, the Shah, and pretty modernized. There were a lot of criticism, corruption, problems,
he was not
oppression.
Well loved, really.
Exactly, he was definitely not well loved. But in terms of the outlook he had about the world, that he tried to modernize the country. He wanted to be closer to the West than what obviously Iran would be today. So he had his third wife and the queen. Right on the eve of the revolution was Farah, and she was absolutely passionate about arts, and she really was a very educated person. She had a degree in arts and so on and so forth. Those years in the 70s, oil prices were soaring. And Farah had this idea: let's bring the best of modern and contemporary art to Tehran, to give our people the possibility of seeing these masterpieces at home, essentially. So what she did is it's quite incredible. She really assembled this collection, and I'm going to say Picasso and, Renoir
Andy
and
Warhol.
Pollock and Andy Warhol and all sorts of and Chagall and Israeli artists, contemporary artists, Yaakov Agam,
right?
All sorts of artists. And she didn't just buy their masterpieces. Very often she also went and met with them or invited them to Tehran. So 1977, the museum opens with all these amazing pieces. And then, just 2 years later, there's the revolution.
Right.
And I'm going to go into the details of what happened later, but basically this collection went underground in the basement, and it took decades before even some of it was taken out. And over the years, there have been some very specific temporary exhibits
where people could go to the museum and see these artworks.
Exactly. And some of the artworks are on display in general.
Right.
And some is not really clear whether they have ever been on display because, for example, you have very explicit images of human bodies in certain circumstances. There are some gay artists that have
Andy Warhol.
Exactly.
Right.
And so
Jewish artists like
Jewish
Yaakov
artists, so you have this situation where the museum. So we knew that the museum was there, and I think it was very interesting to think about not only what has happened before the war and how do we think about it as the war is unfolding, because essentially what I think is very compelling about this is that this is really a snapshot, a glimpse of what Iran could be. Like, and what's also interesting is that there's a lot of contradictions, because obviously everything that has happened there, including the exhibitions of some of these artists,
Right.
they are approved by the regime, because nothing happens in a public institution in Iran without approval of the regime.
Sure.
And just anecdotally, for example, it's not included in the article. I tried to research, what has gone on display. What do we know? And it's very hard because there's no comprehensive list. The museum
There's no website.
Well, there is a website, but it's down because
there's a blackout.
I'm assuming, because a lot of websites that I tried to research, including Iranian news outlets like based in Iran and everything, all down. So it's very hard, and also it's not like there's a language barrier, obviously, and it's not necessarily in the regime's interest to say, for example, 10 years ago we had this piece.
They're not publicizing.
Right, exactly. So, for example, I could not find, as I was researching for the article, any evidence that any of the Agam pieces were ever been on display since the revolution. And then, we have a reader that emails us after the article came out and said, well, I was in Tehran in 2016 and I saw a piece by Yaakov Agam, and we're like, oh wow, now we know that at least at some point it was. And she said, from what I recall, they didn't list Israel as his place of birth, they just listed Jerusalem, which is interesting, right? Because we know the difference, right?
Sure.
We know how Jerusalem is used to,
it's
for many people instead of Israel.
Right.
Exactly. So I think that there's much more to find out about this museum, and we'll try. But it's an absolutely, incredible thing. So it was a great story to work on. And obviously we don't know a lot about what's happening to it.
Right. I was going to say, something that I end up covering a lot when we've had periods of war is how all the major museums here, all the museums, major and small, put all of their valuables, their artifacts, the masterpieces, put them into their basements, into their sheltered spaces, putting them into protected areas, and so that if something were to happen nearby, those artworks would not be ruined. So is that how you came to the story? Wondering what was happening to the museum?
Yeah, absolutely. Partially was that. Partially, to be honest, Iran has been, on our headlines, for quite a while, and also, with the protests in January. So I started to actually look into it a little before the war, even before the war started, with the process and everything. And I actually was wondering who could give me some wisdom on this museum that I can actually reach to, because obviously the staff of the museum in Iran is
not accessible
to us and to, in general, I think Western world journalists. So I found out that in 2018, there was this very special sort of like catalog / book that cost $1,200, which is
I noted that.
kind of insane, but amazing piece in itself, curated by two an Australian art curator and an Australian writer who wanted to actually delve into the story and the collection, etc. So I reached out to them and I was able to talk to them, and it was very interesting because as they were putting together their book, they also met with the Queen, with Farah, and she shared all these anecdotes with them, for example, how she met Andy Warhol at the White House in the 70s, and then Andy Warhol was very shy. She was trying to kind of go and talk to him, but he would just try to get away. And then finally, it turns out that he was very worried that she was going to invite him to dance. And he didn't want to do that.
Got it.
But finally they connected, and then he even went to Tehran, and he did all sorts of works for the Queen, including a portrait of her, which was actually one of the very few artworks that was ruined, damaged during the revolution, because it was slashed with a knife. But to go back to what you were saying, I don't know what has happened to the museum now. I have seen around social media that other pictures from other museums and news things from other museums, wrapping things, putting them away,
But
etc.
they're also going through that same process.
Exactly. So I would assume that that's what happened, because I want to say this really is not the first time for this museum. In 1979, one of the incredible things that I was told during this thing is that the museum, the staff really like put their lives at risk to save this art. The director of the museum back then locked himself in the vaults with the artworks to protect them, and would not let all these rioters that at that point were going everywhere and destroying everything that was connected to the museum, and he basically did not open, even if they said we'll kill you, and he said I'm not opening. And he probably saved the collection, because in a moment of chaos, obviously everything could have happened. And then once the regime was established, there might have been attempts to sell some of the pieces, and maybe a couple of pieces were sold, but essentially collection stayed intact in those vaults.
I'm wondering if the Shah and the family took some pieces out with them.
Well, listen, it's possible, but not likely, because the Shah and the family left Iran, to go on vacation.
Right.
So it's something they might have, some they might have done. But for example, one of the anecdotes that they shared, that the Queen shared for this book, was that Chagall had given her 3 paintbrushes, and she just left them on her desk in their palace in Tehran. And she says, I just hope nobody ever noticed them. They're still there, because they're just 3 old paintbrushes.
Right, just
they're by
covered in
Chagall.
dust.
So I think that you're definitely right. It's possible. And I mean, I'm sure they took out probably a lot, and they already had things out. But I think that really the most of the collection is still there. And in 2018, its value was estimated at $3 billion. And since then, it probably even went up, even though that was the latest really formal estimate that was conducted from far away.
Right, from a distance.
Yeah, from a distance, yeah.
Okay. Any lasting thoughts that the 2 writers of the book gave you, or any other people that you interviewed? I mean, I saw you really reached out to different kinds of people who would have knowledge of the museum.
Yeah, listen, I think that first of all, it's what's incredible to say is that, again, there have been some exhibits, like, for example, there was an exhibit, a Picasso exhibit, where there was this painting, the painter and the model, that for what I could find out, and that which included, art curators speaking to the press around the world, had never been out since 1979. The painter and his model, which is a Picasso, kind of painting, but you see, the 2 human figures in a very interesting way. So, it might have been deemed inappropriate, but it was out, and it was out with the approval of the regime. And a lot of the pictures that were taken by, let's say, local photojournalists working for press agencies, not only you see these pieces, you also see that most of the female visitors are not wearing a head cover, which I think is fascinating. Not only, we know that a lot of Iranian women do not do it, and it's a form of protest and everything. But the fact that they didn't do it in such a casual way, and they would be okay to be photographed without them in a museum, where, by the way, also a lot of pieces show women without head covers, obviously, including, again, as recent as 2025, and even after the 12-day war. It really tells us, I think, something about Iranian society, or at least part of the society, and what we could hope. And so I think that what I like that, the two writers told me that no matter what, as they talked to the Queen, she never really wanted to go into politics too much, but she always had this idea that one day light will prevail, and maybe, Iran will be in a different place, which I think is what we all hope. And for everyone also in Iran and the world to be able to visit this incredible museum.
Right. Put it on the bucket list.
Right. Absolutely.
For sure. Okay. Let's take a break. When we're back, we're going to talk about your piece looking at this Haggadah with, obviously any Haggadah has Egyptian roots, but this is a particular set of roots.
This is special, yes.
Yeah. So stay with us. And we're back. So your
Oh,
story,
wow.
your story about this Haggadah, Rossella, it investigates the world of Israelites in Egypt. Again, obviously, that is the story of the Haggadah, the text that we read at the Seder. Seders, if you're outside of Israel,
Yep.
two of them. And it's asking whether the description of Exodus from Egypt subverted an earlier Egyptian text. Did I get that right? Or
like-
how would you describe it? Or take us however it makes sense to
So-
talk about it.
I think that, so the curator of the Haggadah, Professor Joshua Berman from Bar-Ilan University, a biblical scholar, essentially was very interested in the question of what are the, so like, Egyptian, what is the Torah trying to, and then therefore the Haggadah trying to tell us about Egypt and Egyptian culture and
its influence?
And its influence on the story of Passover, of Pesach, and what can we learn about our forefathers' experience in slavery during the Exodus from Egyptian sources and the Egyptian culture. And he said that he was always very surprised that this was not investigated more. And so he did. And so he looked into, obviously what biblical academics had to say, biblical scholars, and also Egyptologists. And there's a number of things that I feel like are I found it's a lot of fun, because I think that for those of us who grew up sort of like reading the Haggadah and listening,
you're so familiar with it.
Yeah, so familiar with it, and the songs and the story, and like these things, like all of a sudden seeing that maybe it's not by chance, certain expressions, certain things is fascinating. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So for example, one of the expressions that is repeated throughout the Seder, the Passover special meal or meals we have, is the idea that God took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So he said, this expression seems to be very good to describe how God performs miracles, or how God saves the Israelites, or from enemies and so on and so forth. So we would expect it to find it in other stories not connected to the Exodus. And we know that in the Torah there are certain expressions that are repeated in different parts, and it means something. But in this case, the only way this expression is used is in the last of the 5 books of Moses, the Deuteronomy, and related to the Exodus. On the other hand, if we go to Egyptian sources and even like iconography, this is what pharaohs do. They do something, they defeat enemies with an outstretched arm. They found, a big diamond in a story, and they collected with an outstretched arm. So he said, what if actually the Torah is, as he said, stealing the thunder from its opponent, and actually saying, we are going to, we're going to use their own language to describe things. And in my mind, it also goes on makes sense. And he kind of confirmed it, Professor Berman, that, we know that, the story of the Exodus and the miracles that God performed were for the Israelites as much as for the Egyptians, right? Because the Israelites also needed to find out that God was their God, and that God was powerful, and that they could be saved, and they could be something else other than slaves.
And they could save themselves.
And they could save themselves, right? So for example, another example he gave me is that, when God gives the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai during the wanderings in Egypt, in the desert after Egypt, there's Moses describes the thing that God spoke to the people face to face. And now we know from other parts of the Torah that God says, you cannot see me, you cannot see God and live as a human being. So that's another, maybe it's a little bizarre. How is that possible? The whole people God speaking with them face to face. But again, if you look at Egyptian iconography, pharaohs and gods are very often depicted speaking face to face, embracing, being depicted as very similar. And again, in Berman's interpretation, this is God is kind of saying, you are all as the same status as a pharaoh. I'm not interested in just the king. I'm talking to you as a people, and I think that's also very very powerful in a way. And so there are all sorts of like images, and it's fun. What the Haggadah itself is also
so
fun.
what is that? So it's a Haggadah that keeps on referencing
Exactly, Egyptian
te-
culture or sources or ideas in many different ways about the text itself and
Right.
what's written in Torah, but also like sort of like giving also other interesting pieces of information or food for thought. Like for example, in Arabic, the name of Egypt is Misr. Now, Misr sounds like awfully similar to Mitzrayim, which is the Hebrew word for Egypt, as opposed to Egypt. And so he was saying, like, how is that possible? And so basically he was explaining to me that, one of the most ancient communities in Egypt is actually the Coptic Church, Coptic Christians, and they translated the Bible, and they're in Coptic, and the name of Egypt from the Bible stuck, and then even after the Muslim conquest, the name stuck. But what does the name mean? And the name
Mizra
comes from the Aramaic word Mizra, that means the boundary of the civilized world. And so he was saying how he loved the idea of like Egypt being named after the biblical name, and this idea of the boundary of the civilized world. And so he looked into how do I explain and show it. And so he found these, images of Egypt from outer space, where you can really see that, there are all these lights along the Niles, and then the darkness of the Sahara Desert. And it's like, yeah, even to this day, because obviously we're talking about modern images, you can kind of understand how Egypt could be seen as the boundary of the civilized world, because there's wilderness beyond it.
Right.
And so I think, yes, the Haggadah has, the Hebrew, it's published by Koren. It has all the Hebrew text of the Haggadah that you find in any Haggadah. It has the English translation and all these kind of like commentaries and images that kind of like explore the influences of Egyptian culture and information about Egypt that we can sort of like have a little bit of a different perspective, a new perspective on the story.
Are you using it at the Seder?
I think I really am. Yes, I'm excited. But it's funny. Yeah. I asked Professor Berman if he was going to use it, and he was like, I have children. I don't know if I think it's also very important for me not to kind of like monopolize the Seder with my own
research
shtick and keep it, child friendly. So he wasn't sure. So I thought that was also kind of fun.
So you'll use it. You'll have it on the side in addition to another one.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Of course, we're speaking, again in this strange timing, but let's close out this podcast, this daily briefing. I'm going to say Chag Sameach too, and thank you for illuminating the stories that you've been working on over the last weeks and days, for sure.
Thank you, Jessica, and Chag Sameach, happy Passover to all of our listeners.
For sure. And I want to add a saying that I keep on thinking about that is really being said by a lot of Israelis in Hebrew. The English translation it's from a singer from 1990, and his album he said, "We got through Pharaoh, we'll get through this too," which is it's all over. It's in a lot of you see it on a lot of billboards right now and all over social media, and it's very appropriate for this Passover. So, on this Thursday of Passover, wishing all of our listeners a happy Passover, Chag Sameach. Thanks for listening to this installment of the Times Visuals Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode produced by Yitzchak Ledei. As always, thanks for listening. Take care. Be well. See you soon.